I've certainly taken an atypical path to my budding career as a documentary filmmaker. By training, I'm actually a sedimentary geologist who specialized during my PhD in reading the sedimentary record to assess how things like climate change and tectonics affected a terrestrial hydrologic system about 55 million years ago. But film and photography have always been a huge passion of mine. So much so that actually for one of the chapters of my dissertation, I applied my passion for filmmaking to my love of geoscience education to study how incorporating video, and honestly art writ large, we incorporated things like poetry and painting and music into an introductory geoscience curriculum inspires students. In other words, I wanted to know how incorporating art affected the students' emotional relationship to curriculum. On the more geologic side of my research, though, I actually discovered an ancient river that existed in southwestern Wyoming about 55 million years ago. And needing to name this river, I decided I wanted to honor the ancestral keepers of that area and reached out to the Eastern Shoshone Heritage Center for help in naming this river. So after working with the Eastern Shoshone Heritage Center to find a name that we thought honored the land and their culture, I actually ran into a lot of pushback from my scientific collaborators in my effort to publish this name. I say all this because it was actually around that time, as I was struggling to honor Indigenous heritage in my own research, that I was approached by Dr. Dave Lovelace from the University of Wisconsin Geology Museum. And he wanted help documenting a project that he was working on also in Wyoming. And it was that collaboration actually between Dave and I that led to the film What's in a Name. As I soon learned, he was actually encountering a similar reticence by the scientific community to honor the Indigenous heritage of the communities on whose ancestral land he was working and with whom he was working closely to name these new paleontological discoveries that he had made. But that was honestly the extent of any similarities between my research and what I was doing and what Dave was doing. Because if the steps that I was taking to incorporate and honor Indigenous heritage were here, what Dave was doing was way up here. He was going about collaborating and incorporating local communities in a dramatically better way than I had by simply emailing the local heritage center. His passion, selflessness, and commitment to doing his science more inclusively and more ethically, often to the detriment of his own scientific productivity as he seeks to dismantle more than 100 years of colonialistic practices in paleontology. It's what inspired me to undertake this film. So the original intent for this film was actually a short educational piece documenting what Dave was doing and to be shown at the University of Wisconsin Geology Museum. It was predicated on this collaborative field trip between the museum and Fort Washakie School on the Wind River Reservation. And it was actually during that trip that I saw the potential for a much more substantial film. There was so much more here than what we had set out to do. But to get this project to where I felt it could be, I knew I would need to incorporate the voices and perspectives of local community members. Unfortunately, I had no idea how to go about building those relationships and building those bridges that would be necessary in order to get those voices in the film. So the day of the field trip came, and that was the day I met Reba. She's an elder of the Eastern Shoshone tribe, and she actually opened the day and the field trip with a blessing over the students and us. Unfortunately, health and mobility challenges kind of prevented her from joining the field trip, as it entailed a pretty substantial hike. But several hours later, as we returned to the trailhead, we found Reba still there with a couple other women drumming and praying in a circle. The drumming was soon drowned out by the chatter of more than 40 middle school students as that saturated the space. And after thank yous and goodbyes, the school bus rumbled off and Reba followed out. But about 10 minutes later, as my team and I kind of finished up packing up our equipment, the car came back up the road. And as it pulled up next to us, Reba actually rolled down the window. And she popped her head out the window and she said, "The Great Spirit told me to turn around and ask you gentlemen if you would like to have lunch with me." Obviously, the answer was yes, and we drove the 45 minutes to where she wanted to have lunch. And lunch led to conversation, and conversation led to her interest in the project and the film, and that interest actually led to her offering, without us asking, to sit for an interview for the film. And that interview became the backbone of What's in a Name. Despite the film being founded on this field trip, its backbone seeks to contrast the personal stories of Dave and Reba as it leads to their convergence as part of the naming of two newly discovered species. So both characters actually grew up in and developed a love for Wyoming during their childhood. Yet, while Dave's childhood was one of privilege and the joy of being in the land and learning about Wyoming with his family on family trips, Reba's was that of cultural homicide, as she, like hundreds of thousands of indigenous children in the US since colonial expansion, was sent to a boarding school and prevented from speaking her native language. It honestly does not take a lot of deep thinking to recognize that Western science is profoundly colonialistic. Subsumed in its practice is the inherent assumption that due to the scientific process, there is no higher mode of understanding or relating to the world. And second, perhaps, to even more egregiously misguided religious justifications, this empiricism founded smarter than them mentality has been a leading justifier for hundreds of years of colonialism around the world. As an earth scientist, I see a profoundly tragic irony in this. Considering that the basis for what we do in our research is careful observation of the world we inhabit, it flies in the face of logic to resolutely and wholesale disregard hundreds of years of careful observation of the natural world by indigenous cultures. The principal theme of this film, as discussed via the naming of 3 new paleontological discoveries, is that of recognizing the importance of indigenous knowledge and history, and how honoring these benefits Western science as much as it does indigenous cultures. Inherent in this theme is the recognition that empowering indigenous youth is vital to the future of their culture, as well as to healthier relationships between Western science and indigenous knowledge. My hope is that viewers of this film might begin to appreciate the need to redefine how we approach science in the ancestral lands of indigenous groups, and recognize the importance of investing time and energy into elevating their voices, their perspectives, and their wisdom. Wisdom that was built on thousands and thousands of years of lived experience. One of Dave's goals in his collaboration of the Wind River Reservation community is that of reciprocity. The idea that he shouldn't be gaining anything, even scientifically, without the community profiting equally. I wanted to apply the same mentality to the filming of What's in a Name. And to do so, I collaborated with the indigenous production company, Bravebird Productions, in an effort to address any blind spots I might have as a white filmmaker in this space. Additionally, while I do not intend nor am I trying to make any money with this film, it's always been meant to be free and freely available to the public. If for any reason the film should garner any profit, 50% of those proceeds will go to the Fort Washakie School on the Wind River Reservation. As Dave mentions in the film, the work being documented in What's in a Name is not groundbreaking. It's certainly not original to collaborate with indigenous groups, but it's also not the status quo, and I think it should be. I would love for this film to be another voice in the fight for indigenous civil rights, both in this country and globally, especially within scientific communities that engage with and depend on the natural world as a basis for their science.